Hey, in this lesson, we're going to add in the ability to keep track and have a score as well as be able to place bets. So we do have the elements set up on the page. We have a cash value for the user. And that means that we're going to go over to the init where we're setting up the global variables and we'll set up some values. So contained within a game, we'll start the player off with cash. So whatever we want to start them off with, start them off with 100. And then we also need a variable value for game bet. So we can start the game bet off at 0. And then once we've updated the score, we need to update the cash. So creating a function that's going to update the cash. And I'll just do that right below the init function. And that one was update cash. And what this one will do is this will update whatever the cash value is that the player has available to them. And we're also going to set up a few other placeholders. So we'll have another function which will lock the wager and whatever value is being placed in there. So it will either enable or disable the input bet and set disabled to either true or false. So depending on whatever is passed into lock wager. And this will allow us to either enable or disable the ability to make additional bets. Because once the game is in play, we don't want any additional bets being placed. So we're just going to be able to toggle that with just the one function, passing that information in to the lock wager. And we also want to have another function that can set the bet. And this is going to be whatever the bet is. It's going to lock the wager and allow us to continue with the gameplay. And we'll once again communicate to the user within the status of text content. And we'll let the user know how much they bet. So you bet. And this value is going to be coming from the game bet. And we're going to update the game bet every time the user presses the bet amount and locking it in. So we're taking the game cash and we're equaling it to whatever the value of game cash is minus the game bet. So once we do the bet, we want to update the values that are contained within there. And taking the game player cash object, and we're going to update the text content in there. And that will just say the player cash and whatever dollars the player has left with player cash. So game cash. And we also want to lock the wager. So we're setting lock wager to true. So the setting of the bet is going to be done when the bet amount button is pressed. So that means that we need to go down to where we had the buttons. We're enabling all the click buttons and take game bet button object, add event listener of click to it. And every time it's clicked, that means that we run the set bet function, which locks in that bet amount into the gameplay. And we also want to have a ability to update the value. So let's take game input bet object, add an event listener. And the event listener that we're listening for is change. So whenever anyone updates this value, we want the value that's contained within the cache to update and change. And we already created the function for it. So the update cache can run, and that will visually update the cache as the player's updating this. And not until they press the bet amount will that actually update from the player's cache. So let's add in that function for the update of cache. And first we need to make sure that the input bet is a real number. So we don't want someone typing in some characters. And this is text, a number field, but they still can type in some characters. So we want to make sure that that's avoided. So within the console log, we're going to make sure that it's not a number and game input bet value. And one more bracket there. So we can still copy and paste into it, even though it's a number field. And when I do bet amount, let's refresh, false. So everything is still okay. So this is a numeric value that we're using. And this is, again, the number field. So most of the time, this should be okay. But it's always good to have the checks to make sure that that input field is getting the value that you're expecting. So we'll make sure that it's returning back false. And if it's returning back true, or the game input bet value length is less than 1, then we're going to set that value to be 0. So update the game input bet value to be 0. So if there's no value in there and we click off of it, it's going to go back to 0. So that way we always have a value that we're working with that's contained within that input field. And also we're going to check to see if input bet value is greater than game cash. So we don't want someone betting more money than they have. So taking the game input bet value, so if it's greater than whatever the cash is that's available, then we're just going to set it to whatever the cash value. So let's try that and save. So we can put in 5,555, and when I press 0, and I did forget a period there, so let's try that one more time. So every time I click off of it, we see what happens. It brings it back to whatever my max cash value is. So these are all fail safes that we need to incorporate and we need to think of as we're developing the game, just to make sure that the content is working as expected. So input bet value. So this is going to be the global bet object, and this is the same one that we're using when we're setting the bet. So using the global bet object, and it's subtracting the bet value. And lastly, we need to update the player cash with text content and player cash dollars and the amount of money that the player has in cash. And this is just going to be dynamic at the time as the user's playing it. So it doesn't mean that they're actually committing that value. So save. So now whenever we increment this, you can see that the player cash is adjusting accordingly. And if we put in a super large number, player cash will go to 0, and whatever value was within the player cash is going to be available for betting. So coming up next, we're going to play through and we're going to update the bet values as the player or the dealer wins. So it'll update the cash that's available for the player to play.